So I know sometimes some of these things can be kind of uncomfortable. So I just want to make sure everybody's kind of in a comfortable space. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly what you're getting yourself into. This particular presentation here is called I Feel the Shame, I Feel the Same. The reason I call it this is specifically because it's a ubiquitous process, shame in the counseling process between both the counselor and the client. A lot of times, whatever the client is feeling, and we don't choose to explore that, is actually something that's also impacting us at the same time. So, an important quote, kind of something I consider to kind of give me an image of what that looks like, is shame can sink lower than the surface of the ocean. The more we panic and the more we lose grip of our feet, kicking just below the waves, the further the current pulls us under. This particular presentation kind of talks about some things that are specifically deeper than the context of other trainings. And I just think it's important that we kind of get ourselves in the right headspace. And to kind of move into that, I'll go ahead and move on here. We see shame in so many different ways, in so many different contexts in our life. Some of these things you may even relate to, some of these things you may have experienced. And some of these things you may have just seen and you kind of have a sense of empathy, and it's just very hard to consider what to do, what can we do about it. Now, just here in this particular video, I just wanted to show a brief portion of that, kind of give us a way to imagine what shame looks like, how it can impact us. So let's just take a second here to kind of get an idea.
Symptoms, but to generalize grossly, few things so undermine human well-being as the sickness of shame. The guilty feel bad for something specific they have done. The shamed feel wretched simply for being. The affliction lacks borders. As shamed people, we don't connect the myriad ways in which our behavior and feelings are driven by a base conviction of our own abhorrence. We just take it as a given that we are disgusting. We lack the capacity to imagine that our shame has a history and therefore, perhaps, a future that could be curtailed. The first step in untangling ourselves is to get enough distance to spot and name the problem. We might make use of a little questionnaire. Out of 10, rate how true the following statements feel. I don't deserve to exist. I am defective. I am unworthy of being known and loved. I am a mistake. I deserve to be abandoned. I should not be. Anything over an 8 starts to indicate the problem. But if there were an option, most of us in the shamed camp would want to award ourselves 100 or more.
So this kind of gives us an idea here of how shame impacts us in a way that we can possibly or impossibly be able to give it a number. It just becomes like a difficult process inside of us, and shame can make it difficult to kind of get in touch with what's really going on inside of us. So once we think of some of those statements, some of those 10 different statements they gave us there, how do those things impact us in our life, and how do those things impact us as professionals? So kind of to move on and try to get us in a safe space here together, I just kind of want to move into kind of like a meditation. So here we'll just take a moment, we'll close our eyes together, and just give yourself a moment to think about, when was the last time I felt a sense of shame in my life? Now, how did this particular moment transform my thoughts? And when you give yourself the space to think about how that specific moment impacted you personally, impacted you professionally, impacted every moment of that particular time in your life, how were you able to overcome that sense of shame? Were you alone? Was there somebody there? Was there somebody there to listen to you? Or was it just hard to find a space to feel like somebody could understand what was going on? And of course, we can continue to talk about some of these things as we move into this presentation. And I know a lot of those things are kind of difficult to get in touch with. They're difficult to kind of pinpoint. So let's move on here. So I did put this portion of the presentation in here because I was trying to get an understanding of what shame looked like in specific trainings or other videos that were available, and that was really hard to find. So let's just keep in mind, so we've all heard about the shame research and the clinical professional Brene Brown. She's a very important asset to research on shame, even in the professional world. The kind of idea, the kind of clinical aim of this particular presentation was to try to move outside of the exploration and awareness of shame and just the general population, but now into just the counselor chair, the work we specifically do with our clients. Some of the objectives here that we will cover are just how being able to identify the specific types of topics or material that evoke shame specifically for yourself in session. And then we'll be able to analyze and evaluate the client actions or even the behaviors that lead to the transference or countertransference that occurs in session. We'll be able to contribute some of these materials, this guidance and training that can be applicable to different clinical settings, whether that is a private practice, whether that is an agency, and be able to propose and initiate some other consultation groups that kind of center around this topic and just in the counseling field in general. So, and then we might be able to, with all of this information you're able to take away from this, be able to measure and evaluate the shame experience and your competency in terms of that experience as a counselor, trainee, or professional. So a lot of this research kind of tells us, it moves us into the direction that shame is ubiquitous. So specifically in Greenberg and Iwakabe's research, shame is a cycle that may be initiated way before the client's initial session. And because of the humiliation of exploring shame can lead to resistance and exploration. What this kind of touches on is the process of us understanding exactly how shame has impacted us before. In the same way I gave you a moment here at the beginning of this specific presentation to think about the last time shame came up in your life and how you were able to approach it. So reciprocity begins a shaming dynamic in the counseling process, because not all therapists take the step to engage in empathic connection with their client's emotional experience. And that's something we have to be able to do. That's something that can be scary for us if we're not able to get an awareness or grasp the mindfulness of what feelings come up for us when we feel that shame. But we need to be able to not only get in touch with that, but be able to get in touch with our client's shame, even if we fear that maybe that's something that's going to be difficult for us. I touch on meeting the expectations of the client here because there's a statement called the paragon of psychological health. In Tangney and Deering's research, I was able to find in a 2011 article that talks about us being able to kind of meet those expectations that the client have for us ahead of time. In the same way, we have this expectation that we need to meet the client's needs ahead of time. And so what that means is that paragon is that sometimes the client has this expectation that we need to meet all their needs and we are the role model. We are a role model of psychological health. And so that kind of puts us in a situation where we can easily feel shame by trying to meet that expectation for our client. To move on, when we talk about stress and burnout, researchers have kind of set the stage for how we handle challenges in the counseling process. So without an appropriate awareness of our reactions to handling the level of stress presented to us, the more there might be a chance to negatively influence our perception of what resources are actually available to achieve and maintain our own wellness. The more shame we feel inside of us, the more shame impacts us personally, even professionally, kind of deludes us from everything else that's possible to reach out to, every other resource that we can reach out to when we're feeling that shame. So let's kind of talk about some of those styles of even perfectionism and how perfectionism styles can actually impact our roles as counselor professionals. The first here is maladaptive perfectionism. So maladaptive perfectionism is perfectionism that builds barriers in thinking, which includes setting unrealistic standards, being harsh if those standards aren't met, and wanting control over the situation. So beforehand, burnout, we talk about burnout as the process of a state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion that results from long-term involvement in work situations that are emotionally demanding. So in a study of 178 counselor educators, researchers identified a 3-class system for perfectionism, which was maladaptive perfectionists, adaptive perfectionists, and non-perfectionists. Maladaptive perfectionists have this idea that, hey, I'm going to build this beautiful sandcastle. I'm going to build this wonderful piece of art, and it's going to look something like this. And then I start thinking, okay, well, while I'm in the process of doing that, I don't have all the right tools, and it's only going to end up looking something like this, which isn't what I imagined. So because of having that maladaptive mindset, I start thinking, well, it's not good enough. And then in the same sense, that can translate to something like, I'm not good enough. The work I'm doing here, the expectations I set for myself, isn't the standard I have met, isn't the standard I have in my head that I want to meet. To move on, we start talking about adaptive perfectionism. Those with adaptive perfectionism think ahead about standards they build for themselves. Standards here are more realistic, and when individuals with adaptive perfectionism fail, they question their preparation. So we kind of get this idea that, okay, again, I'm going to build this wonderful piece of art, this immaculate thing. And then I start thinking, okay, well, all I have is a bucket. All I have is the ability to form one pile of sand. And it's just not enough. So I start thinking, though, well, it's okay. It's okay that it's not enough, which can then translate to something like, well, next time I'll be prepared. Next time I'll think, okay, this is the idea I want, and this is the idea I've set up for myself. But I need to make sure next time I think ahead. And then again, non-perfectionists. Anyone classified specifically as a non-perfectionist doesn't specifically set higher standards for themselves. They show lower levels of perfectionistic desires and even little to no concern about those standards whatsoever. So here we are, I'm feeling great. I'm feeling like I did what I needed to do because all I wanted to do was build a castle. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, in this case, I'm content. And that can translate to something like, well, I did my best. All I wanted to do was build a castle. So hopefully those kind of ideas, those kind of images of even just building a sandcastle on the beach and that mindset of something calming like the beach kind of gives us a better idea of what that looks like and how shame can come up in the process of even the styles of perfectionism that we have as professionals. Next here, I want to talk about how shame is bidirectional. So shame in the counseling relationship is bidirectional, which means that it can occur and be evoked in the counselor and the client. As counselors, we honor the role of searching for and valuing the authentic and secure relationship with our clients. So counselor shame can easily be defined as an intense and enduring reaction to a threat that the therapist's sense of identity consists of an exposure to the therapist's physical, emotional, or intellectual defects that occur in the context of psychotherapy. So here in the same manner, we as counselors can shame and even re-shame, whether it is our intention or not. Awareness, again, is so valuable when we're working with our clients. How can we be in touch with that? How can we know whether or not we're reacting to that experience of shame that even we may not be able to explore with our client, but we sense is there? Opening the history of another's vulnerable attachments can evoke shame from experiences with our own attachments. So again, how do we define counselor shame? And that's where I talk about how it can impact us in different ways. It can impact us physically, it can impact us emotionally, or even intellectually. Sometimes we may feel like we need to turn to a different space in our mind to be able to overcome that deep sense of shame that is evoked in session. Certain things to keep in mind. So when we're working specifically, thinking about traumatized and addicted populations, some of these are the most difficult cases we'll work with. Some of these are the most unprepared cases we may come into a contact with. So let's talk first about secondary trauma. Secondary trauma is a manifestation of post-traumatic stress symptoms based on a client's narrative. These, again, are things we feel that come up for us only based on the material that the client is presenting to us. Some of these things that are presented may be dreams, distressing reminders for the client, the shame avoidance that comes up for the client, and the willingness to explore that, or even hyperarousal that occurs in session. Next, we have vicarious trauma. Just like secondary trauma, it involves a reaction to the material shared by the client. But in this case, the counselor may not have been about counselor shame itself. We talk about this process being bi-directional. Not only is this experience of shame between counselor and client ubiquitous in nature, it is also bi-directional. So as counselors, we honor the role of searching for and valuing the authentic and secure relationship with our clients. Counselor shame is both something that occurs between the counselor and the client, and that is what I mean by bi-directional. So in the same manners, we as counselors can shame or reshame, whether that be our intention or not, in session with our client. So it's important to understand when we're opening the history of another person's vulnerable attachments, we can easily evoke that same sense of shame that may come up for a client and experiences with their own attachments. Counselor shame in research has been defined as an intense and enduring reaction to a threat of the therapist's sense of identity that consists of an exposure of the therapist's physical, emotional, or intellectual defects that occur in the context of psychotherapy. Let's move on and think about what are some important things to keep in mind. When we're working with traumatized and addicted populations, some of those experiences that may come up for us are experiences of secondary trauma. This is a manifestation of just post-traumatic stress symptoms that occur for us based on what the client is saying. And these are experiences that we may have had earlier on in life that we maybe connect with that our client is experiencing. These can be in terms of dreams they've experienced, distressing reminders that they're recalling, shame avoidance that comes up. How willing are they able to talk about some of those things that come up in their life? And then hyperarousal, just reactions that are occurring while they're occurring in session. So we'll keep in mind of some other forms of trauma like vicarious trauma that occurs for us. Like secondary trauma, it involves a reaction to the material shared by the client. The counselor may not have been directly involved in the same type of trauma, but it can still form symptoms like safety concerns for the counselor, developing trust issues, whether that's with people in our life or even the client themselves, understanding our own intimacy issues, experiences of cynicism, and those are just a few of those things that come up from those experiences. And we talk again about burnout. We talk about feeling exhaustion physically, mentally, emotionally, just from excessive generalized exposure to those long-term emotional cases. And to continue, we may experience countertransference. This is something we probably all heard about in training, not as much as we may have even heard about shame in training, but these are based on prior experiences with trauma or addiction, and those may even be co-occurring. So a client can easily project their reactions or their experiences directly onto the counselor. So we have to keep in mind, we have to still build that awareness about how we're going to react to that situation or how we're going to be able to get in touch with knowing that that is occurring in session. And then there's important strategies for self-care. It can be physical self-care, it can be emotional self-care, it can be our relational self-care, our professional self-care, our spiritual self-care, tons and tons of options between each of those components of self-care. And then certain societies, like programs that have been established by things like the Tri-County Mental Health Society, are figuring out ways to offer and connect and to gain awareness about working with those with traumatic material. And these forms of self-care are just some of the forms of self-care they've been able to approach within their mental health communities. And that's kind of what this consultation training is kind of getting us in touch with, is certain resources that we can look to when we experience things like these in session. Let's talk about the value of shame in training. Some important points to consider. Feels like I can't talk, I'm sorry, but we have to consider the degree of awareness and processing of shame from our past. How important is it to think about some of those things that we've experienced in our past, and how can we reflect on previous experiences of shame as they've occurred in our life? Previous experiences that may be in the same experience that we've had with our clients or the same experience that your client have had. Let's give yourself a moment and think about areas of your life you haven't had the opportunity to explore. How have earlier attachments impacted who you are And can we think about some of those shame-based traits that come from experiences like that with your earlier attachments? Because those experiences themselves can give us experiences of inadequacy, give us negative self-thought, make us feel like we have narcissistic traits that we need to overcome some of those experiences, and even perfectionism. And so that was an important point for me to consider during this training, because I feel like we all have different styles of how we approach standards in our life, but that can even come out of experiences of shame in our life as well. I just wanted to talk briefly about work I did with a specific client in a situation where it feels like shame was very pertinent to that specific case. So I work with a client that vividly remembers a moment in her life where she was shamed. This experience, she quoted very clearly, was that she was hit with a rush of sadness and expressed this feeling to her manager at work. She remembers him responding to her, "You have to accept that. You're always going to feel that way." In her life now, she has found that others have left her feeling, "Why don't my feelings matter? Why didn't anyone care to ask what I was feeling?" Now, the value of this moment, and like many others in counseling sessions, is the importance of understanding earlier attachments. Shame left unnoticed, unprocessed, or devalued has a way of washing over us when we're in session with our clients. It has been described as reenactment. It's a fear of connection that occurs between counselor and client. These are experiences with shame-based fears that essentially lock down the therapy relationship. By us maintaining a detached confrontation, well, I as a counselor, I don't want to go there. I may have experienced something like that, so it's just going to be too much for me. So I just want the client to kind of walk over that because that's what they're doing already. Or we may come off like we're seeming absent from the session. We seem like we're not in touch, or we may be wanting to take prescriptive protocols. I like to say this is kind of that form of structure is safety. I turn logically to this model, and as long as I stick to that, I don't have to dig any deeper. And then that, in the same sense, feels like we need a form of power. We need a form of control over the situation, and that gives us that. If we can turn logically to some model, if we can turn logically to some specific intervention, maybe we feel like it's just going to be easier for us, then that's what that's going to look like. That's what's going to lock down the therapeutic relationship and make it harder to be able to emotionally process that shame. And even researchers have expressed that these types of counseling behaviors can cause further damage. Now, when I talk about further damage, I mean if a counselor turns to an intellectual approach to help a client overcome those presenting issues, they might risk reinforcing an insecure attachment, much like those a client experiencing shame might have experienced in the past or still is. So more awareness comes with recognizing areas of our work that might elicit a sense of shame in ourselves and the unprocessed emotional injuries we've experienced with others. Furthermore, there's still the necessary mindfulness that comes with recognizing when we've done any of these shame-based, even avoidant behaviors that have come up. Now, this includes recognizing guilt for having possibly caused harm, addressing the issue by bringing it up also to the client's attention, and then apologizing for any harm that was caused. I was interested more in statistics or numbers. I feel like it's important just to draw back to some research that was produced by older published articles on the topic of shame or emotional impairment in the mental health profession. I know more recently, and with more recent research articles, there isn't as much material specifically based on the mental health profession or population in general, but I know there's so much value in understanding that different people have different learning styles, different people have different personality styles, and this may be very useful some of those people in this group, and for some people that are trying to understand and gain more knowledge about what that looks like in terms of numbers. So based on an 1989 American Medical Association article, they claimed that nearly 1 in 10 practicing physicians and each of the nearly 6,000 practicing mental health professionals dealt with a mental or emotional impairment. To kind of get an idea of what that looks like more recently, I did and was able to find a 2010 study that invited 94 practicing professionals, both licensed mental health counselors and registered mental health counselor interns, to a specific study on burnout syndrome. So, of the 69 completed survey packets, of being 83% female and 17% men from various cultural and ethnic backgrounds, 87% of those in the study already had master's degrees in areas of psychology, psychiatry, or clinical mental health counseling. Considering the statistical numbers weren't actually relative to the qualitative research in the findings themselves, it is still noted that with licensed mental health counselors, there was a reported lower number in emotional exhaustion than in interns. And those working specifically nearly 15 to 22 hours a week in admin responsibilities alone were more likely to express an increase in emotional exhaustion. Again, it does always come back to awareness. It does always come back to the amount of work, the amount of effort we're putting into what we're doing. What standards are we setting for ourselves? Why did I talk about perfectionism first and earlier on in the presentation? Because there's value in understanding those standards we set for ourselves, how we understand ourselves, and what impact is that going to have on us, and the amount of shame, the amount of embarrassment, the amount of guilt in the work that we're going to do is going to look like. Because the more work we're putting into areas of our life that we're putting so much stress and so much pressure on ourselves in, is where we may be able to experience more of that shame. But we have to understand why we're experiencing it and what impact it's going to have on the work that we're doing. Now, to talk a little bit more about shame and burnout, we go back to this concept of heal all, love all, know all, this expectation that some clients have for us, this conundrum that's just so hard to get in touch with, that we kind of set standards for ourselves about. And let's talk about some vulnerability and professionalism in the process. Well, we start thinking, well, can I really help this client? Am I good enough? And do I have the right skills? So we start thinking about this consistent need to ask ourselves such questions that are common also in the reports of burnout, in these studies that have these numbers that I've talked about. In the same way, we start setting higher levels of responsibility and reasoning, stressfully, about ethical considerations that can promote this experience of shame. The idea of actual self that is presented into research about mental health professionals and shame. The idea of actual self is presented in a way so that we can understand our own identity in terms of what perspectives are we building with our client, what is our worldview, and how we've been impacted by our past experiences and our attachments, how have we been shamed, what is it that is impacting us from our past that maybe we're not in touch with, that's maybe subconscious. And then we move into the idea of ideal self, which is another piece of us that is like, well, what are we thinking about in terms of expectations we have for our client? If our expectations of the client themselves is they know all, they are this psychological figure that knows everything, that can provide to us everything that we need and have the answers for us, then this is this idea of ideal self. And research tells us the differentiation between the two and the understanding of shame is in 3 different areas. So to kind of talk more about those 3 different forms of shame, we first talk about the collusion to avoid. This involves reacting to a client's shame avoidance, their inability or unwantingness, that resistance, that reluctance to explore what's going on in their life, when feeling one's own shame. As the counselor, we start feeling the same thing. We start feeling that same experience once we notice it in our client. And we also choose not to explore it. Secondly, we start to move into intersubjective reverberation. This entails the client's own expectations. Again, we're moving into ideal self. We start thinking in terms of what the therapist is also doing in terms of expectations. Now they're starting to create expectations for their client in the same way that the client is creating those expectations for the counselor. Third, we move into treatment failure. This is when the therapist is already holding in the internal struggle. Since the beginning, you may even notice it. Maybe you think you've done some great work. Maybe it's been hard to kind of consult. Maybe it's been hard to find a supervisor that you feel like may be understanding of what's going on. But you've already decided in your heart, you've already decided in your mind that you feel like this is just going to fail, you're not doing good enough, and that treatment's going to have to end. So in a study conducted in 2012, researchers utilized this therapist embarrassment and shame questionnaire that I've noted here for you. So this is a qualitative 3-response questionnaire that allowed each of the participants to report 3 instances where they reported feeling shame or embarrassment. Embarrassment meaning here detecting a drop in self-esteem that was short-term, versus shame being a stronger disturbance, again, to the actual self, to one's identity, to the counselor identity, to their perspective, to their worldview. After being able to label and sort these reported events into three categories as noted here: content, definition, and examples, findings suggested that the common issues addressed were scheduling mistakes or arriving late to sessions. In their second chi-square analysis, they reported meaningful reactions from being late as apologizing or taking action to remedy. And in cases of arriving late, the main reaction was to apologize. So we keep in touch. We try to think of ourselves in these ideas. If they've not happened yet, what would it look like? How would we react? How can we build that awareness prior to this occurring to you and for yourself and your client in session? In the same study here, it's also noted from previous research that it's been shown to express the value in determining what areas of a therapist's work with client will or has evoked shame or embarrassment, and how can we utilize awareness and disclosure to kind of move through the process of overcoming that shame. Talking about how we can utilize shame as a tool for our awareness and also as a tool that we can utilize for our client's sake. So let's start by understanding that some previous research has helped us explore this idea of how we can utilize this as a tool for awareness. And researchers by the name of Hahn and Racker in two different research articles suggested there are two specific forms of countertransferences that can occur in session. And remembering, shame is projected. It means that parts of us, even as counselors, are compartmentalized and then externalized again and projected onto the clients that we're working with. So let's think about this again, this role of attachment, this need to build affective attunement with our client. The role of attachment, the role of caregiver is so important in the work we're doing with our clients, because you can be working with somebody who has never felt that sense of love, never felt that sense of security, never felt that sense of trust, the value that you're supposed to uphold in a counseling role. And it's just so valuable that you give your client the experience of affective attunement, of positive self-regard, so that you can recognize and be aware of the parts of you that are coming up in session, and so that you can provide them that sense of comfort that they need in those really important moments. So let's talk about those styles of countertransference. There are two specific styles. The first, complementary, refers to a therapist connecting with the sense of shame, of self that the client relates to, while concordant countertransference relates to the connection to deny or provide support for this responsibility that the client has in this particular situation. In complementary countertransference, we find a need to detach. We see withdrawal behaviors occur in our client, and we want to do the exact same thing because we've had experiences like that. We have experiences we haven't processed that are subconscious, we're not in touch with them, and then in turn, we express embarrassment afterwards. We express that it was difficult going there. We express that it was hard to give that affective attunement to our client. And then in concordant countertransference, we just want to fix it. We just want to find the easiest action-oriented way to kind of follow the model, follow the structure, find the easiest ways to intervene, and then just move past the shame. And this can occur in situations even when our client has expressed self-mutilation occurring in their life and other relationships in their life, or even turning towards wanting to harm themselves by burning themselves, wanting to cause harm to somebody else. Let's kind of look into one of those cases and try to figure out what type of countertransference is occurring in this situation. So in the case of a client who has struggled with shame, based on experiences of fulfilling a career and success from mainly his father's influences, he expresses depression and suicidal thoughts to his female therapist. After 3 months in session, the client noted he had no sexual experiences nor dated another individual. He noted he would masturbate several times a week, but the therapist continues to focus primarily on the suicidal ideation and depressive mood symptoms. As sessions progressed, the client noticed the therapist was wanting him to pay ahead of session. The therapist reported in supervision she was embarrassed to explore sexual issues, and she noted she felt detached from the client. She said he didn't feel as involved and would miss several sessions, but that he also talked about fantasies about men, and that he wanted to think more about women instead. What form of countertransference is occurring here? And when you're thinking about that, when you're hearing it, maybe you've even come up with it already. If you thought complementary countertransference was occurring, you're 100% right. Good for you. So that is in terms of that feeling of detachment, that feeling of I need to express embarrassment. I don't want to go there. I sense something's happening for them, but because of my experiences, because of my ability and my knowledge to know about digging into that emotional experience, what's going on underneath all of that fantasy, what's going on underneath all of that sexual behavior, if I'm not willing to go there, I won't be able to provide the best solutions for my client. So clients might even express again this feeling of self-mutilation, this feeling of wanting to burn themselves or having already had to do so, but for two different purposes: to either destroy or remove feelings of shame and unworthiness, or they might do it to eliminate this disconnect from physical feeling, this sensation of numbing what's going on physically. A concordant behavior in session might mean that a counselor is action-oriented when they hear about self-mutilation. Therefore, they relate to feelings of disvaluing oneself. I feel that too. I want to do that to myself. I've tried to do that. I've done that to myself. And I never processed what it was like, what was going on underneath, what was that social isolation that I was experiencing, and where was it that I needed that comfort in my life. And we focus again in concordant behavior on the overt damage rather than the interjecting shame. So after we kind of explore what this sense of shame is like, we can think about maybe we need other resources. Maybe we need to explore our own personal psychotherapy. Maybe we need to find self-work solutions for ourselves to be able to endure this shame, to be able to process this shame, so we feel comfortable going there with our clients. So the counselor can therefore also be a model for utilizing their own withdrawal behaviors and their tendency to turn towards logic, or models or interventions that are easier for them to help the client analyze and make sense of their own behaviors, to help utilize your own subjectivity to inform the client's sense of shame. Now I want to talk about this need again to just specifically love all. We feel like one of those expectations for our clients and one of those expectations for ourselves is that the counselor is going to love us, the counselor is going to be there for us in all the ways that we need, but we also have this feeling of shame that may come up for the feeling that we need to love all of our clients. We may feel that, hey, if I can't connect with, if I don't enjoy the fact that I had a session with a specific client and it didn't go the way I wanted to, or I just don't specifically or particularly like this client, you could feel a sense of shame about that need. So Christian Sanderson, in a 2015 research, does a very great job at explaining the emphasis on awareness around semantic sensations or even romantic feelings that occur with our clients. So anything can occur in session, from whether it's the sounds of hunger within our stomach, blushing, hot flashes, sweating. It's important that we explore some of those sexual or romantic feelings that we have towards specific clients. So there's a more valuable need here to recognize the pressure of fitting this expectation to love all. And instead, there's a much needed awareness that needs to happen around examples of how this impacts us in session. So we can explore that by choosing not to express those feelings about the client in consultation or with a supervisor. Because if that's occurring, how can we reach out? Where can we reach out to find support? Because if maybe the supervision we're having doesn't feel like it's meeting the needs of us as the counselor or as us as the intern, then we have to find a way to be able to explore that, because it's important. It's important that we don't turn ourselves away. We don't feel like we can't find a source to overcoming that shame. And often counselors might even account for this reaction as a transference on the client's part. So we're blaming the client for our experiences of romanticism that occur in session, our experiences of sexual feelings that occur in session. And instead of taking into account those erotic feelings for the clients as shame, they can be explored in terms of attachment and dynamic. Again, the importance of affective attunement with our client, the importance of being the secure attachment for a client, especially if that's not something they've been able to understand or value because it's not been an experience they've had in their life. How can we use those feelings? How can we use other forms of countertransference, other forms of vicarious secondary trauma in our life, or that comes up in session? How can we utilize those moments to reflect on what the client is experiencing and help them understand what it is they need in their relationships and their attachments in their life? And the last thing to consider here, the last thing here is when we need to reach out. We don't have a supervisor that we feel comfortable talking about this with. We don't have other consultation groups. We don't have other trainings that are available in the moments we need them. We don't feel like we have support in that moment. But we have resources everywhere we are. We have resources like this that are available online. And we ask ourselves, where can I find that support? Look to the person to your left. Look to the person to your right. And right now, if you feel like maybe some things have come up for you in this training, maybe some thoughts are coming up for you, questions you're asking about the clients you're working with, anything specific like that, and you realize that right now you're in a space where I've been able to help you provide yourself some safety, to provide yourself trust in the people around you. And then again, you remember that you find somebody that can give you that affective attunement, because we're all in the same profession. And even if you're going through this training, you're going through your professional career as a student, and you've got to enter your internship, and you're just interested in understanding how this can impact you, I've provided the resources with you by providing that sheet in front of you to kind of get you an idea of what those takeaways are and those main points are. And there's even a document on there. There's a table on there that you can utilize in your own research. You can utilize in the work with your clients. And that's, again, being able to notice specific instances of what shame has looked like or embarrassment that has occurred in session for you, what that looks like and how it impacts you personally, and some alternatives to consider. What are other resources I can look to when that occurs in session? Or what are some ideas? Or again, how can I take that subjective material that's occurring and how can I utilize that to inform my client's own behavior? And you've kind of taken some information with you. You have some resources. You kind of have a general layout of those takeaways from this presentation and a way of looking at that as it comes up, shame, as it comes up for you in the process of counseling, and even kind of retrospecting on some of the clients you've already worked with, some of the cases that you've been able to notice you struggling in. Let's take a look again at this problem of shame and kind of get a little bit of more of a review of what that takeaway is and how shame comes up in different ways in our life.
What are we ashamed of? Our mind? Facial appearance? Physique? Genitals? Anus? We were not born ashamed. We should summon up the voices that gave us our legacy and which we have then internalized and blended with our own. You'll never amount to anything. You're the family idiot. You disgust me. Others may wonder why people around us behave this way. The answer is clear enough to the shamed. Because we deserved it. We wouldn't be truly shamed people if all it took was a few simple questions to shake us from our conviction of our detestable identity. We were shamed because we were and are defective. Our caregivers weren't mean. They were, above anything else, perceptive, even brilliant. They could spot things that later, kinder people cannot. They had the true measure of us. Shamed children don't blame their guardians. We protect them for a weird but logical reason, so as not to feel entirely alone. We prefer to think well of our caregivers than to take on board how badly we've been let down, with all the convulsive rage and sadness that would entail. The consequences of shame are written across our lives. We don't allow other people to get too close to us. They would only be appalled if they knew the true us. We're not so good on physical intimacy. We get scared all the time. Bad things happen to bad people. We don't like parties. Why would anyone be pleased to see us? We have a lot of secrets, for most of what we are is unacceptable to other eyes. We go in for addictive behavior to escape our self-hatred, then feel even more ashamed of ourselves for the unholy things we've done. What is the way out of shame? The same popular answer is to tell ourselves that we are beautiful and good, but that won't easily convince us. There may be a better, more oblique strategy to bypass the defenses of the shamed. We should stress not that we are wonderful, but that every human being who has ever walked the planet is, in their own way, radically imperfect and broken when observed from close up. We may be a bit wrong, but so, blessedly, is everyone else who is and has ever been. We can be stupid, perverted, and uncouth, but that is wholly normal. Rather than implicitly upholding an ideal of goodness by telling ourselves that we do, after all, measure up to it, far better to throw away ideals and all notions of achievable purity and goodness. That's where the problem started. Better to accept that we are, as a group, entirely crazy and ill-tempered, wicked and odd, but then to stress just how much this is a reason for mercy and kindness, rather than censure and condemnation. Let's stop judging ourselves and others by unreal standards. That's how we made ourselves ill. Let's laugh and comfort each other for the absurdity and horror of existing in human form. The primary sin of those who made us feel ashamed was not so much that they spotted our flaws, it's that they forgot their own awfulness, and then had the gall to blame us for our own. We should give up on fascistic perfectionism in order to make a generous home for our cracked reality in our own and in the collective imagination. That'll be the start of our way out of the problem of shame.
So again, we kind of see all these ideas come together again. We start out by asking ourselves these questions. Again, these 10 different questions, and even more if you think about it, of how shame shows up in our lives and how it impacts us and makes us think certain things about ourselves. I'm not good enough. What I do will never be enough. And then I'm just a burden on this world. I'm a burden in this passion of mine. I'm going to feel burnout because all I do feel is shame, and I can't get in touch with what it is I want to feel because it's just so hard. And again, like we are when we're growing up, and like this video has noted here for you, we do turn to logic. We want to believe that those people are there in our lives to comfort us. We want to believe those are around us who we don't necessarily have trust with are going to care for us if we need to reach out to them. And it's easier to turn to logic. It's easier to believe that we fit in this world where we can find comfort whenever we're experiencing shame, whenever we're experiencing guilt, whenever we're experiencing embarrassment. But we have to realize that when we choose to accept what's going on, we find the source of the problem. It becomes much easier to see all of the other alternatives in our life. It becomes much easier to turn to those other professionals, those other mental health resources that kind of can extend beyond our family, extend beyond those things that have caused us shame in our life. And then we can find comfort. We can find a greater understanding of what's really going on underneath our reactions, what's really going on underneath our clients' reactions. And we be able to find a sense of understanding and a sense of knowledge about that so that we can move on with our lives. We can move on knowing that we've processed those hard emotions. And this is the beauty of what I'm doing to bring you guys together, is so that you know that everyone else around you is open to exploring that too. Everyone around you was vulnerable enough to come here to talk about some of these things. And again, I appreciate each and every one of you for being able to do that, opening up your mind, opening up your hearts, and now you have those tools. So get out there and use them.
At the School of Life,